This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great change, when authoritarian rulers began to establish their power or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Geremie Goldkorn, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. For our first show, recorded on February 18, 2025, I am delighted to welcome Geremie Barmé, a dear old friend, but more importantly for this podcast, a sinologist, historian, filmmaker, translator, and author of a shelf of books on China. In 1974, in the dying days of the Cultural Revolution, he went to China as a student and occasional farm laborer, and he has studied both the ancient and modern history of the country and observed firsthand momentous changes. These include the death of Chairman Mao Zedong, the Tiananmen protests and deadly crackdown of 1989, and the rise of current strongman ruler Xi Jinping. We're going to discuss the echoes, parallels, and rhymes he sees happening now in Musk and Trump's America, with periods of great change in recent Chinese history. Geremie, welcome to Rhyming Chaos. And how is everything down there in New Zealand, 8,000 miles away from me here in Nashville, Tennessee?
Thank you, Geremie. Well, here all is well. What could I say? We little drop in the South Pacific. It's sunny, it's calm, it's quiet. And of course, the nation is quaking at the thought of the world unfolding around us as the American hegemon beefs up its militant policies, and the Chinese hegemon wants to extend its control to this part of the world. You probably don't know, but recently China has been interfering with what is known as the realm of New Zealand.
The Cook Islands, are you referring to China?
That's correct.
Rather aggressively.
Indeed. The Cook Islands, your listeners might not know, but the Cook Islands is actually part of what is known as the realm of New Zealand. That is within the embrace, but not controlled by New Zealand. And it has just concluded a new strategic partnership with China without consulting Wellington, the New Zealand capital, or our government. And that has really freaked people out.
Well, yeah, I guess the people need to be prepared to be freaked out a whole lot more in the coming months.
About the hell of a lot of reasons. Nothing compared to the tears of the military chief of NATO, mind you.
Well, let's get into some of these things. So you recently wrote a piece titled Contra Trump, American Tedium, which sort of is a spin-off of your Empire of Tedium series about Xi Jinping's China. And in this piece, Contra Trump, you mention a thesis about previous moments of radical transformation that often violated the rules that governed normal politics in the United States. This comes from a Noah Millman essay in the New York Times. So the three moments he talks about are the founding of the United States, the Civil War, and the Great New Deal. And then Millman proposes that the current Musk-Trump takeover of the US government might be fourth such a moment, a complete change in normal politics. And you go on to describe four events in recent Chinese history that we could consider as moments of radical transformation, or in your words, four coups in post-1949 Chinese affairs. So what I'd like to do today is to go through these four moments, have you describe what happened in China, and then for us to see what those events might tell us about what's happening in America right now and the future under Musk and Trump. So let's start with 1966, when Mao Zedong overturned the party state on the pretext of saving the nation from Soviet-style revisionism. That's the Cultural Revolution. Tell me what happened.
Well, before we go into that, I'd just like to mention that my series Contra Trump was launched just after the election in November, American election in November 24. And it's a series of essays, mostly other people's work on elements of the American transformation that are taking place, protests and engagement with contemporary issues, and also contrasting certain elements of that with Chinese reality. I think it's about time, as I say in my introduction to the whole series, for a bit of whataboutism, because the parallels are now between these autocratic, or one well-established autocratic state and one blossoming autocratic state in America, are worth talking about in tandem. Now, the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution, generally understood, is seen as beginning around on May the 16th, actually, 1966, with the announcement of a Central Committee ruling that China was going to undergo a massive reorientation of education, thought, the legal system, and the rest, the destruction of the old world, the creation of a new world. Now, this seemed very odd at the time to many observers, but within China, it had been building up for many years. In fact, the immediate origins of the Cultural Revolution were 1957-58, the Great Leap Forward, when Mao and his immediate colleagues, the more radical side of an already radical government, believed that in competition with the Soviet Union, originally one of the founding influences in China, and in competition with the Western capitalist world, that China could now, because it had become a unified, strong socialist state, it had the chance not only of advancing rapidly, carrying out a great leap into modernization, new technology, agricultural modernization, and so on and so forth, but it could actually leap into communism itself. Now, that failed disastrously, but Mao and his colleagues, in particular a couple of his theoreticians, believed that that attempt had to be tried yet again. And they proposed another push towards radicalization, and that came about in 1966, beginning with a radical transformation of the educational system and the health system. But the Cultural Revolution itself...
the education system and the health system, that does sound somewhat familiar. It tracks, yeah.
Please refer to Christopher Rufo's book on the American Cultural Revolution. No, indeed. In fact, Mao's first pointed comments on the need to radically change things in China were aimed at the Ministry of Hygiene and Health. Anyway, the Cultural Revolution itself, apart from these ideas and the desire to sort of radically communize China and leap into the future and become the leading power in the world, was the idea that China was facing crisis. It was facing a crisis over successors to the revolution, the belief that ideological weakness was undermining young people, that they were straying from the revolutionary ideals of their forefathers, that there was no actual real successor to Mao himself, that China was faced with a global crisis, America pressing on it from the east, the Soviet Union pressing on it from the north and the west, and that the Chinese economy needed radical revamping. So it was launched in the Senate because Mao and his colleagues made the case that China was facing imminent collapse, foreign enemies, and internal threats. Sounds a bit familiar too. The internal enemies in particular was Mao's great target.
Yes, and I mean, in Trump's America, the internal enemies and the external threats are sort of compounded in the mythical threat of, the vast armies of illegal immigrants who are committing crimes.
Well, indeed. In China, the whole system, Mao declared that the system was already being corrupted by what, to use Trumpian or rather Steve Bannon's words, a deep state. That is, China was being held to ransom by a group of people who were later named as capitalist roaders, i.e. people who were taking a political line that was not radical enough for Mao and his colleagues. And these people occupied every element of the Chinese bureaucracy, education system, and all of the public life of the nation, and they had to be purged.
Wow. That does sound... Yeah, I mean, you just have to change the names and the dates and the particular descriptions of what exactly the enemy is up to.
There are parallels. As you were saying, there are rhyming moments. In this process, Mao, for years, since the Great Leap Forward, had been searching who are going to be the activists, the core of this the further revolutionary transformation. And he tried many approaches in 64, 65, but it was not until 1966 when he received, interesting enough, a document that a number of young students at Tsinghua Middle School had passed on to his wife, Jiang Qing, during a rally. This document was called Long Live the Spirit of Rebellion. 3-part document written by a young chap and his friends, Luo Xiaohai and his friends who would call themselves Red Guards, Hong Wei Bing. There's 12 of them. And they wrote this document, got it to Jiang Qing, handed on to Mao, and they said that they believed, they were following Chairman Mao's comments on the dangers of the educational system being too reactionary, the problems in the health system, and the problems with these capitalist roaders. And they suggested that they would carry out Chairman Mao's rebellion and overthrow the old world. They call it smash the old world and create and build a new world of greater hope and possibility. Mao, in July 66, responded to this letter, this document with a broadcast letter that led to the establishment of the Red Guard movement that inspired then tens of millions of young people to rebel against the state. Now, there was no reason to rebel against the state, but Mao and his colleagues had created such an atmosphere through the media and through their speeches of dread, threat, and fear that when young people rebelled, they just rose up against a system that they found repressive and unacceptable in many ways. And they unleashed also in the process in extraordinary violence.
Wow.
During the process, one should point out, so as the Red Guards rampaged, encouraged by Mao and the Cultural Revolution edicts, as that unfolded, the government, Mao's shock troops began to create a new political entity that became a parallel world that overthrew the original bureaucracy and established another bureaucracy. At one point in late 1967, Chairman Mao, actually at his birthday, declared that he celebrated the fact that China was in a state of civil war. He said, long live the civil war that he had created.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that does sound very familiar. It sounds...
it will be more familiar as time goes on, Jeremy, I fear.
As time goes on, yeah. I mean, this is what's happening with Doge or Doggy.
And Doge, we've heard recently that Doge is going to be insinuating cells or groups into every major American federal bureaucracy. And this is exactly what the Maoist era cells did. They transformed the party cells that existed and put in new cells led by radicals who wanted to fight the old bureaucracy and establish revolutionary new order. Now, having said that, what happened in China in 66, 7, 8, 9 was particular in terms of its own context and history, revolutionary traditions, language, ideas, as well as Mao's unique personality. But the behavior of overturning a system, carrying out what is called an autogolpe, a coup against one's own order, usually carried out by a leader against a bureaucracy that they find that doesn't conform with their ideals or needs or whatever. This type of autogolpe is not unique to China in the 60s or to America now. This is how a certain kind of autocrats with a certain amount of power, media influence, carry out authoritarian rule.
I suppose this details are always going to be different, but power operates according to the same rules.
Power is power is power. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's move on to the second moment that you identify as a sort of autogolpe or a coup in post-1949 China, which is the Huairentang coup, when key leaders of the Maoist government were arrested and the pre-1966 old guard were restored to power to lead a decade of actually what was quite good by many people's judgments, a decade of economic and tentative political reform.
So simply put, so the Huairentang is the hall of embracing humanity. It's a major venue inside Zhongnanhai, the party state leadership compound in the center of Peking next to the Imperial Palace.
The Mar-a-Lago of Beijing, as it were.
Well, the Mar-a-Lago, no, the Mar-a-Lago is a summer White House, after all. That was, if the Maoist era, that was down in Hangzhou, where Chairman Mao had one of his major villas.
So let's not confuse the listener, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're getting too complicated. But so Huairentang was this major meeting hall, and in early October, shortly after Mao's death in September 1976, the military leadership, the military was headed by Hua Guofeng, who was the new chairman of the Communist Party, who had been put in by accident, really, by Mao in April 1976. Hua Guofeng, with the support of or under the guidance of a number of military leaders, called in the executive of the Chinese government, that is the key members of the Chinese government, known later as the Gang of Four, and they arrested them all. Then they eventually put them on trial, persecuted and jailed them all. It was in fact a military coup under the direction, though, of Hua Guofeng, but it was a military coup carried out against the party state that had been put together in the wake of the Cultural Revolution. Dramatic, and what it did see, as I mentioned, a number of older leaders from the past, they'd already actually been brought back in 72, 3, and 4, because after this radical period under the Maoist revolutionary ethos from 66 onwards, things didn't work anymore. Once they'd carried out the revolution, transformed the bureaucracy, and changed everything on the basis of revolutionary impetus and idealism, lots of stuff didn't work at all. So Mao began to reinstitute a lot of the old policies and bureaucracies of the past from 1971 to onwards. And he did so in particular by bringing Deng Xiaoping back into power over the protests of people like Zhou Enlai and others. But then Deng had been purged again, and the older comrades who had begun to be reinstituted in the early 70s were brought back again following this coup of 1976. They then collectively reoriented China, not in a radical new way. They began to carry out the kinds of economic reforms that they had first promised to carry out in the early 1950s, but which had been delayed in particular following the Great Leap Forward. So they were catching up on the 20 years wasted by the the radical revolution. And they began instituting reforms and basically turning back towards the 50s to free up enterprise, to free up agriculture, to free up industry, education, so on and so forth. And this transformation, later called the Open Door and Reform, began to offer up astounding possibilities for a broader Chinese economic and social transformation, which we saw through the 80s, which led to this extraordinary, ebullient blossoming of Chinese life.
So, I mean, this was in fact quite a good coup, if you could.
Well, yeah, there were good and bad coups. It was a very good coup.
It was a coup where the resulting period is better than the preceding period.
Oh, without doubt. No, without doubt. A massive transformation, a positive coup, and one of the great turning points in modern Chinese history. October 76, the Huairentang coup was a good coup.
Right. And I suppose the fans of Musk and Trump are arguing that this is what's going on right now.
Well, they say exactly the same things that first Mao had said in 66, 67, and the coup leaders in 76, 77 said, which is they were saving the country.
Right.
Yeah, same rhetoric.
And they sort of did. But the current lot, I fear, I mean, at least the communists seem to have the welfare of the ordinary person at heart.
But Jeremy, one would say it depends on your politics, I suppose.
It does depend on your politics. I mean, everything depends on your politics.
Everything depends on what they call, 阶级烙印的立场, as the Chinese say, the stamp of your class background and your position.
Yes, the stamp of the class background. I mean, and that's something that's going to, I think, be very interesting in the United States in the next few years, as some people who are Trump voters but are from the wrong class background might find out that things are not quite as they thought they were.
Well, you're talking about what's called the FAFO phase of the Trump revolution, the fuck around and find out.
Right, the people who fucked around are going to find out. Some of them.
In China, things were not that analogous because, of course, people didn't have much agency at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the reform period, as we discussed, began sort of with the Huairentang coup, instituted from 79 onwards, and blossoms extraordinarily in the 1980s. One of the most astounding, the most astounding period I've lived through in my life, an incredible, extraordinary period. And it led to, of course, this burgeoning possibilities of civil society, massive economic transformation in China, and the beginning of China to reconnect with the past in the sense that many people, intellectuals, lawyers, political figures even, and lots of people in the university sector and in society broadly wanted to develop what we would call a modern civil society, whereby those who had been enriched by reform wanted to have a say not only over their lives, but also about social participation and the future of the nation itself.
I don't think that dream really died until perhaps 2014, 2015.
No, you're right.
I mean, for certain people like you, the thought that might be possible died in 1989, which is the third coup that you identify, right?
I must correct you. For people like me, it died in 1979. I was not a believer that reform, because I read all of Deng's speeches. I read the speeches of all the other leaders, all the stuff that was possible to get hold of. And it was pretty clear that these older leaders, as long as they were in control, they would make sure the economic transformations taking place in China would not lead to major social or political change. That was very clear.
And why 1979? Just because you'd read enough by then?
Well, I was living in Hong Kong. I'd been working in China first, but then working in Hong Kong. I had friends who had contacts who were at the Central Committee meetings where all these issues were debated in 78, 79, and it was pretty clear because the party decided, as I said, it went back to the 50s to carry out economic changes and transformation, but it reaffirmed all the basic and most draconian aspects of Maoist Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi's rule from 49 to 57. And they said everything we did then was correct in terms of politics, economics, and not economics, but in terms of ideas, educational control, and culture. And because they weren't going to open up the floodgates to real social or political transformation, it meant to me that one had to keep an eye on things and not pretend that there was going to be some massive social transformation and there'd be hope for some China becoming, more, to use that American expression, more like us. I never believed that from 79 onwards.
Okay. Let's say for somebody a little less informed and a little less cynical than you, probably that dream lasted until 1989.
People, and here I just must add, people who weren't really...
No, you don't need to diss on the people. Let's move on to...
No, I need to say that it's not just people who didn't want to really take Chinese thinkers or Chinese politicians seriously. They didn't read what they said. They put their own ideological overlay on what people were saying in the 80s, and they treated it slightly, there's an element of colonial hauteur and superiority, treating Deng and the others as they're pragmatists. They're not interested in ideas. That was outrageous, and it led to extraordinary and dangerous miscalculations thereafter. So I'm not dissing on people. I'm just saying.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. And perhaps that actually is another sort of rhyme with what's going on in the United States right now, where even today, February 18, the New York Times is not quite taking seriously the things that Trump says and his coterie.
Exactly.
They don't actually believe yet that he wants to completely change the country.
You're right. Exactly.
At its very core. Yeah.
And, they write about the Project 2025 and they report, they do an interview with Curtis Yarvin and they're interested. They do an interview with some.
If I may, let's explain. Curtis Yarvin is also known as Mencius Moldbug, who is a person who has been writing on the internet about politics and America's future, and who is taken very seriously by a lot of people in Elon Musk and Donald Trump's circles. Is that about right?
No, yeah, he's a radical neoconservative, a proponent of what they call the dark enlightenment, i.e. something that moves against all the ideas that one has about civil society, democracy, public participation, liberalism, and so on and so forth. He's been active now for 20 years. And when I first read him, I thought, this guy, a fringe thinker. But in the last 10 years, he's moved to have extraordinary influence over people like the Peter Thiel and through him, J.D. Vance and others. He is what I call him, to use one of those parallelisms, I call him the Zhang Chunqiao of American politics. Zhang Chunqiao became a member of the Gang of Four, but he first became a thinker who tried to influence politics. Well, he first became active in the 1930s and 40s, but in the 50s, he managed to get some of his essays up to Mao. And those essays that he wrote on rather obscure theoretical, Marxist-Leninist theoretical ideas became the basis for the Cultural Revolution. But nobody knew that until 10 years later, when suddenly, oh my God, these ideas are actually informing this radical movement in the 60s. So when one thinks of America now, you think, these crackpots like Yarvin and a number of others, many of their ideas have been taken up quite seriously because they do offer a type of, for the Musk gang, a techno-utopian view of how one can transform government. Anyway, we're getting off topic. We should go on to our third Chinese coup.
Let's go on to our third coup that you identify, which is, I think you write, when Deng Xiaoping and his fellow post-Mao gerontocrats overthrew the head of the Communist Party and toyed with a 3-year-long counter-reform in 1989.
Indeed. So, as we discussed, this extraordinary economic transformation began in China really from the late 70s and ran through the 80s. And lots of people became very hopeful that there'd be further change. and evolution of the system. And there were many attempts. It's not as though, I said I was very gloomy about it from 79, but there were thinkers, activists, and others in China who pushed again and again and again to change and evolve the society. And the number of political movements were carried out from 1981 onwards. In fact, about 4 political purges of these people were carried out through the 80s. Nonetheless, by the late 1980s, the economic reforms were really beginning to pay off, and China was beginning to economically flourish. Politics was relatively stable. Society was booming. And there was debate, even at the highest levels of the Chinese government, that perhaps we should start to carry out a meaningful kind of political reform that will go beyond the parameters of the 1950s and actually allow our society to politically and socially evolve in keeping with the economic changes that are taking place in terms of private property, participation, civil society, and so on and so forth. So there were ideas that perhaps China could move in a more generous direction along the lines of the kinds of things that were first proposed in China in 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Anyway, that led to, for various reasons, to do with economic missteps, to do with social disturbances, and also to do with the pressure of what you would call the radical conservatives or radical revolutionaries, depending on how you want to see it, within the government, the factions who said that kind of loosening up and change will inevitably lead to the fall of the Communist Party, the destruction of our privilege, and also we, the conservatives, believe will lead to the collapse of China as a unified and strong nation that can become the world superpower. Anyway, those clashes occurred in 87, 88, and 89. And Zhao Ziyang, who was the party general secretary, who was proposing moderate political change and reform, very moderate, slight media openness, legal reform, and so on and so forth. He was used as the scapegoat. He was purged by Deng and his colleagues in late May, early June 1989, as a result, or during the tumult created by the student demonstrations of 1989, which themselves were partially sparked by popular fears of corruption within the government, social disturbance, in a sense that China was heading in the wrong direction.
And also inflation, right?
And massive inflation. And great
another rhyme.
Another rhyme, indeed. And the fear of corruption, the fear of foreign influence, the fear of internal enemies. There's certain similarities. That led to the purge of Zhao Ziyang, and the negation of the possibility of political reform and legal reform that had been mooted by many thinkers and many high-level party apparatchiks as well in the late 80s. And this led to what I said, the 3 years counter-reform. From 89 to 1990, early 92, China retrenched politically, economically, and socially. And it was also a bit of a pariah internationally.
But then that started to change after 1992.
That changed because Deng didn't carry out a coup, but by 92 it was obvious that the Chinese economy was really suffering, that sclerotic, older-style, revanchist Maoists had taken control, and none of them had any answers to China's social, economic, or political problems. And Deng Xiaoping, for all of his faults, for all of his limitations, of which there are many, the man was also an astounding figure. He virtually single-handedly launched a new stage of reform by means of a series of, he traveled to the south of China, and a series of comments and speeches and remarks he managed, and also manipulation of the army and the government, he managed to launch a radical new phase in China's political economic transformation, this sort of new wave of transformation. He said at the time in 1992, we've debated socialism and capitalism. We're constantly wrangling over theoretical issues and where China should go and what the system is and how it should evolve. Let's put all of that aside, what is called the Xingzi and Xingshe debate, the debate about whether our surname is capitalism or socialism. Let's put it aside for 20 years and just develop. If we don't develop, China, the People's Republic, will go the way of the Soviet Union and we will collapse because we're simply not performing economically. And that led to this new wave of
marvelous period. Yeah.
Sorry?
Most of the period that ushered in, I was living in China.
Exactly. So you really know it very well.
It was optimistic. Everybody thought things were getting better. For 20 years, we could kind of forget about politics and kid ourselves that the space for individual expression and human rights was expanding. But then He literally gave it 20 years.
He said 20 years, therefore ending in 2012.
2012. So, God damn it. At the end of 2012, what happens? Xi Jinping ascends.
So we don't have time to go into that extraordinary 20-year period, which for, many of my friends were incredibly hopeful as well. I was always watching what all the theoreticians and the party apparatchiks were saying and doing, and the message from them was pretty scary. Anyway.
It was pretty scary, but, it's not only China. I mean, it's the entire globe. I think from the 90s to the early 2010s was probably, there has never been a time in history when so many people have been so optimistic and open to one another.
The globalizing period. And here one would point out that we're talking about China and focusing mostly on China, but China has been, since the mid-19th century, closely enmeshed with what's happening in the rest of the world. So there's ideas, fashions, and zeitgeist that flow back and forward. So, and China has always been, no matter how high the walls of Zhuhai are, it's the flows of ideas and practices from the rest of the world permeate the world of China throughout those last 150 years. So one has to just remember that, just as it is now. Anyway,
2012, end of 2012, it's November, I think, right? Xi Jinping.
He comes to power. But we'd point out, we discussed this at the time. 2008, we first saw very clearly the first signs of what was to come. And that in particular, under Xi Jinping, he was put in charge of and managed to get the position of being in charge of the Olympics, the Beijing Olympics, of Summer Olympics of 2008. And he was also in charge of security. And he began to pursue a security approach that I had first experienced in the Cultural Revolution. It's called the Maple Bridge Experience. Anyway, don't have time to go into it. But when I began to see that, and in particular, I got wind of it because you and I and a couple of friends went on a road trip out to the Great Wall. And during our trip, we noticed that all these local barriers in local villages and all the vigilantes had been empowered to try and to question and interrogate anybody who came near them. And we were stopped and interrogated by a number of agents of the state during that time.
For the first time in more than a decade, it suddenly became difficult to just drive around in the countryside in China. Yeah,
exactly. And that was the beginning. And I was reading about why this was. It was part of what was called the Peaceful Beijing Action Plan, which is in fact a modernization of the Maple Bridge Experience from the early 1960s. And Xi Jinping had pursued that. He'd also over those years, been publishing a lot of essays in the Hangzhou press. And I used to read those because I went to Hangzhou every year for my work. And he began writing these essays. And in those essays, he expressed a really hardline view of the Communist Party and its future. So anyway, after the Olympic period, we saw in 2010 and 11 moves within the Chinese government already to restrict freedoms, to control education, and to reinvigorate ideology. Around the same time,
I mean, if I may interrupt, you mentioned this sort of outside environment. I think 2009, you had the global financial crisis when Wall Street was proven to not be omniscient and omnipotent. And then you had, from about that time till about 2012, you had various popular movements, the Arab Spring, popular protests in Iran, fueled by the internet, that I think really unnerved the Chinese government. And this predated Xi Jinping actually coming to power.
Quite so. And not only did they unnerve it, again, they repeat the types of things we saw in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The Chinese government, because of its extraordinary achievements in the 1990s and the most favored nation treaty relationship it had with America, the boom in relationships with the EU and its accession to the World Trade Organization, Chinese leaders, with all of these other problems, social disturbance, possibility of dissent and protest, also felt we are moving. We're becoming rich and strong in a way that we were hoping for in the 50s, that Chairman Mao had hoped for with his radical revolutionary aims in the 1970s, to become a major global power. And this ambition, completely reasonable, completely understandable, began to really take clear shape in tandem with all this sense of threat and danger, internal and external, and that built up from, and also with the founding of America because of the global financial crisis, the Chinese leadership began to think this is our chance. These possibilities are unfolding.
This is the context, Geremie. So I think you wrote when Xi Jinping, who would soon, we're talking about 2012, when Xi Jinping, who would soon become head of the party state army, carried out a rolling bureaucratic coup against the state and installed himself as chairman of everything and engineered a position of terminal tenure. So what happened?
Well, indeed. So Xi Jinping belongs to the Cultural Revolution pseudo-Red Guard generation, though he wasn't really formally a Red Guard, but nonetheless completely imbued with that type of radicalism, idealism, and also patriotism, the Cultural Revolution era. And also he grew up within the bureaucratic system to work at various levels of the government and gain incredible experience as a bureaucrat and as a thinker. He and his colleagues, and he inherited, after all, the Jiang Zemin's major group of thinkers led by a guy called Wang Huning, who's now a member of the Politburo. These are people who are all trying to put together an ideology that is both wedded to Marxist-Leninist theory, to Maoist praxis, as well as neoliberal globalized economic policies. So he rises, he's becoming more and more influential in the 2008, 9, 10 period, has a big clash with his competitor, a guy called Bo Xilai. And what happens is really a purge of Bo Xilai. He falls from grace, and Xi Jinping manages to grasp the nettle and become leader.
She was lucky enough, I'll put some links in the notes to this podcast, but she was lucky enough that Bo Xilai's wife murdered an Englishman.
Exactly.
And was caught.
So extraordinarily blessed by events, he was indeed. And he also seemed to be, in his bureaucratic career, a man of incredible mild manners, principle, and clean living. And his mentors and supporters thought he will be a pair of safe and steady hands to put power into, because he will just continue the process of China modernizing and transforming. Xi, however, and many of his friends and colleagues felt that China was facing an incredible moment of danger and collapse. The word used at the time among the elites was that China was Wanqing in the late Qing dynasty. We're facing the collapse of our unified government, and there's an incipient danger, and we need a strong leader, not only to maintain control of the party and the government because of all these disparate influences in society, but we need a leader with vision who knows how to look to the past, to find things there that are relevant to the present, and to actually forge a path to the future. And Xi Jinping became that person. And he came. And
it wasn't an unreasonable way of thinking at the time.
Not at all. Not at all.
Wen Jiabao, the previous premier, number 2, had talked about the 3 uns, that China was unbalanced, unequal, and what was the third un? Essentially, that there were a lot of problems in society, and Deng Yuwen, who at the time was the head of the party school, I think. No, the party school's journal, Study Times.
Study Times, it was called.
Right. He wrote this essay that I think we translated for the website under your center at the Australian National University, The China Story, as the 10 grave problems left behind by the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao administration that Xi Jinping had to take over. So the idea that you needed somebody strong who understood the past and could grasp a way to the future wasn't a stupid idea.
No. And what Xi Jinping is not, I find it abhorrent, but I'm not in favor of dictatorship. But he gets into power with his colleagues, and he believes, and he's studied and been thinking about these things for years and years and years. He's first named among an echelon of younger people in 1983 as a possible among the coterie of possible successors in the future, the 3rd or 4th or 5th generation of leaders. So he's been sort of in the wings for many decades, the 30 years before this. He gets into power, and he knows how the system works, and he and his colleagues realize that the state bureaucracy, competent in many ways, and this technocracy has helped transform China into this astounding modernized country. But they also believe that it's profoundly corrupt, that it has no principles, and it's entirely lost its way. So Xi Jinping, from late 2012, as soon as he gets into power, and in fact this begins before he gets into power, through 2013 and 14, establishes a series of what are called leading groups. These are supervisory groups that are above and beyond the actual government bureaucracy. And he names himself chairman of each of these key leading groups that takes over not only the military, but all aspects of civil society or governmental practice. And he basically carries out a coup against the state.
So could we compare this to the Doge in the United States now, where the theory of Musk and Trump is that there's a deep state that is taken over and that is deeply corrupt. So you need this organization that is actually outside the control of the conventional government to go in and clean things up?
No, to an extent, yes, indeed. There are similar. It's the idea that the strong man comes in, cleans up an inefficient system or an endangered system, and resolves problems that many people want to see resolved but don't dare deal with because of bureaucratic restraints, because of convention and habit and social pressure. So Xi Jinping comes in and begins this process with his colleagues. He's obviously been sitting back and thinking and debating these ideas for decades. And he carries out, like many of his predecessors, we call it an autogolpe, a self-authored coup against the system you actually run, to carry out a renovation, or what I call a restoration of China's fortunes. And to a certain extent, given China the issues that were facing Xi and his colleagues in the 2010s, political, social, cultural, and economic, although economically he doesn't get as many points as one would perhaps think he should have, but in other regards, he's done pretty well. In fact, remarkably well, given the last 10, 12 years. This has been among the most continuous stable period in modern Chinese history, in particular if one thinks back over the history of the Communist Party from 1921. Only at one point in its history, in 2003, was there a peaceful transition of power. And given that a coup or some kind of incredible political ruction took place every time any major political or economic policy change was launched. So Xi Jinping has managed relatively well during this period. However, he has also brought back into Chinese life the problem of the succession crisis and long-term stability, the very things that Mao had recreated because of his Cultural Revolution, and that Deng also created by the way that he managed his autocratic rule in the late 1980s.
And he's also destroyed the notion that one might have a kind of a cultural or intellectual life that is not subservient to the state.
Indeed, and that is a matter of such a vast tragedy, and I've written a great deal about it, that it's hard to encapsulate in any simplistic formula. Yes, indeed, he has really, his style of rule and his narrow vision, he's a pusillanimous thinker, he's a man of narrow spirit and mind, has really limited what is this, as you know, this incredibly ebullient, incredibly interesting, innovative, creative society. Luckily, of course, lots of energy has gone into, technological innovation and transformation, economic change, and so on and so forth. All well and good, but for those of us who are interested in more than that, it's more than the mere animal spirits of humanity and the mere economic materialist base of reality. It's a rather sad period.
One wonders at the moment in the United States, because Trump put himself in charge of the Kennedy Center.
You've got to love it.
Which is a classic tin pot dictator move. And I mean, this happens at the same time. We have previously discussed how, despite all this stuff going on, for example, the Super Bowl half show was this amazing display of joy by Kendrick Lamar, an African American, despite all the crazy stuff going on in the country and the oppression that his ethnic group has had to endure over the decades and centuries in this country. But part of me wonders, how long can this even continue if you think that Trump has done something that even Chairman Mao didn't do? I mean, he may have put his wife in charge of cultural matters, but this is a serious kind of Banana Republic behavior, isn't it?
No, indeed. I mean, though, to give due credit to the great Chairman Mao did transform the Chinese language, transform the way people think, speak, and can express politics in China in a way that resonates to this very day. So that's good 60 years on. I doubt that the Trump Trump 2 will have that kind of long-term impact. But yeah, I mean, the Trump regime, and we can't call it a government. This is a banana republic regime.
A junta regime.
Yeah, it's a junta. Yeah, let's not even pretend.
A junta. Yeah, the Trump Musk junta. The Musk Trump junta.
Yeah, exactly. And the American constitutionality, the minute that Congress did not respond to the impoundment of funds by the executive branch, by Trump, a few weeks ago, the American Constitution was, if not completely knackered, at least nobbled very badly indeed. Whether it will survive is hard to say. No, it's quite a unique moment in world history, and those of us on the periphery, as I say to you often, are all quaking because it means such profound changes, and nobody knows. As Xi Jinping would say, the world is experiencing profound changes of a kind unseen for a century.
Amazing. I mean, that phrase of his, which is said many times, has proved to be
it's true. I would point out that when he said it, one should remember it was 2017 when he first mentioned it. The other change 100 years earlier had been the Russian Revolution. So in the Chinese landscape, transformation is about the rise to power of an enlightened proletarian vanguard led by the Communist Party. That was first achieved by the Soviet Union in 1917, or by the Bolsheviks in 1917. The second major global transformation is now, and Xi Jinping believes that China is leading it. That's what he meant.
Well, if this bunch of bozos that seem to be in charge over here carry on, I think he's going to be proved accurate.
It's what's called is providing opportunity to massive transformation. And the way America's going is, people will be saying, well, China might be loathsome in many regards, but gosh, compared to America today and what it's done and how it deals with its history and how it deals with its problems, whether they're gender or race related, as well as equality and economics. You look at China and think, yeah, it's pretty terrible, but not that bad.
And as we've discussed previously, if they really take over as the global hegemon, the food will get better.
As I've said, that's my mantra. At least the food will be good.
At least the food will be good. Yeah.
Pretty grim, but as Confucius said, "Mini shu wei tian." Yes, it's the food, baby.
It's the food, baby. Or everything else is kind of irrelevant. It's
if you can feed yourself, that's already you're really ahead of the game.
I mean, you are in many ways. Well, Geremie, what a pleasure to talk to you about these things.
Thanks. Well, no, but we should end on points of health. So, on the American side, from my point of view as an outsider, but I've spent much of my life working in America on the documentary films I worked on, lecturing there, traveling there, and have many connections and friends in America. America remains, after all, this astoundingly creative, ebullient, amazing society. So, one has to keep that in mind.
There's always hope.
It's got a fuck you spirit that is pretty magnificent. And on the Chinese side, for all of its limitations and problems, biological attrition will take care of Xi Jinping sooner or later. Of course, he will send the country into a succession crisis and a legitimacy crisis, perhaps. But it, too, has this astoundingly vibrant, complex society that nothing under Xi Jinping has been managed to crush. I just mentioned that when I lived in China first, in the Cultural Revolution era, 1970s, mid-70s, the Cultural Revolution ended in October 76. I was working with my classmates picking apples in the People's Commune down in Jinxian County outside Dalian. And we heard about the arrest of the Gang of Four on shortwave radio. And we told our teachers, who then immediately locked us into our dorms, fearful that we'd tell anybody else. But then a few days later, the news came through that there'd been a military coup, that Hua Guofeng had led the party to crush the Gang of Four. And the minute that was announced on the radio, our teachers began to silently sotto voce on the sidelines of our apple picking would say, I never could stand Jiang Qing, and my God, that Jiang Qingqiao is a monster. And immediately the whole system, not only did everything begin to collapse, but people began to say what they felt and thought more freely than they had probably for 20, 25 years. It was an extraordinary experience to experience not only the collapse of the Maoist regime, but to see this immediate flourishing of just Chinese narkiness, complexity, indomitable spirit, and to realize, oh my God, not even Mao and that regime could possibly crush this. So that's not happening under Xi Jinping either.
So there's hope.
But not hope, it's just humanity. My God, this complex, rebellious, appalling, but magnificent thing.
People can survive. They can survive the most terrible things, yeah.
And flourish in the most extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Geremie.
Pleasure.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn. Today I was speaking to Geremie Barmé, looking at comparisons between United States right now and China. The theme music of this podcast is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei, and our cover art is by Li Yunfei. You can subscribe to us on any place you get your podcasts. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next time.